This lecture focuses on diversity in sport management. So not necessarily just who's playing, but also who is leading. So the lecture discusses levels and factors related to diversity, some laws and policies that have increased access to various groups of people, and then finally ends with a discussion of factors that lead to successful diversity initiatives. The article argues that there are two types of diversity. One is demographic, so things like age, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, physical disability, are aspects that can be visible to others. In comparison are psychological factors, so things like values, beliefs, and attitudes that are not maybe as observable, that you can't necessarily see, but that lead to diverse opinions and perspectives. So diversity can be viewed from three different levels. The first is the sport industry as a whole. So some things that go along there. So who's leading that industry? Who owns the teams? What do they look like? What policies, federal or national policies, may influence the sport industry in terms of hiring practices and access to those sports and to those jobs. And then next level down is a sport organization as an individual. So those national policies may trickle down to organizational policies in which they have equal employment opportunity statements. They may be more or less diverse in hiring practices, training programs. So the NCAA has training programs for female coaches and female administrators to try to increase women in those positions of power. And then the third level is the individual, which again comes back to access and inclusion. So are there programs in areas for people with disabilities? Are there low income, low cost programs for people in communities that can't afford to play at an elite, very expensive travel team? Because if you aren't playing sport at these lower levels, it's going to be really hard to get a job in sport leadership without that background and without that network. Cunningham identified a few different factors that have led to an increased concern with diversity in the workplace. So the first is changing attitudes towards work. We can make the argument now that people want to be a little bit more fulfilled in the work that they do, that the work that people do now has changed. It's a lot more interactive. You have collaborative groups at work. You're often working with other people and not on something by yourself. In addition, the demographics, particularly in the United States, are changing to become more racially diverse at the basic level. So these are the first few things that have led to an increased concern with diversity. In addition, Cunningham argues also that there have been some legal mandates or laws like the American with Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Title IX that have created a more diverse pool of people from which to draw from and have actually now included people that have historically been excluded from employment. In addition, to go along with that, there have been social pressures for that organizations have felt to now hire people that they normally wouldn't have hired in the first place, but now they kind of are getting or feel compelled to because they'd face a legal wrath if not. So here's an example of what diversity looks like in the NBA. So as of 6 years ago, there were no women who were in positions of assistant coach, head coach, general manager, and so on. So this chart is basically just assumes that they're all men in these positions because there are. If you look at it from a race standpoint, the majority of the league is African American. Yet only 43% of the coaches are African American. Majority of the owners are white. So the question becomes, why does this matter? Well, one, you want people to have the idea that they have role models to aspire to, so that they can go from being a player, maybe if you don't make it to the professional level, to being a coach, to being a general manager, to being an owner, because those are much more long-lasting careers than being a professional athlete, which your career in the NBA only lasts about average 3 to 4 years. So it's about access and opportunity to these positions of power that people of color historically in this particular league have not had. Here's a little bit more on the laws and policies that I may have talked about on the previous slide. The first is Title IX, and that's designed to promote gender equity in educational institutions that receive federal funding. So your middle schools, high schools, colleges, and universities, and it's drastically increased the amount of female athletes participating in sport over the last 45 years. The Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 is related to employment discrimination, or trying to eliminate employment discrimination and provide access to public accommodations. So things like parks, pools, public transportation, stadiums, to enable people with disabilities to fully integrate in society and have opportunities that they've been excluded from in the past. The next policy is the Rooney Rule, which is in the National Football League, and it just requires organizations to interview a minority candidate for a head coaching position if they're looking for a new head coach. So the idea is to kind of open the door a little bit so they get an opportunity to interview. They don't necessarily need to hire anyone. They just need to give people an opportunity, which people of color in the NFL have not had a lot of opportunities to be head coaches or general managers or owners. And finally, the International Olympic Committee actually has a percentage mandate on gender in a lot of their working groups and committees, where they have to have at least 20% of people on that committee identify as female, because in the past it's been all male committees making decisions for groups of people that may lack a little bit of synergy and understanding of what's actually going on in that sport. So once you've actually hired diverse candidates, or candidates that come from diverse backgrounds, whether it be race, gender, socioeconomic status, ability, disability, and so on, there are several factors that lead to success. But really the key of these factors is leadership and manager support. Without that, any diversity initiative will fall apart because it starts at the top. So if you have managers that support it, they provide leadership around how to create policies and procedures that create an inclusive work environment, trainings that allow people to engage in discussions about diversity and maybe create, again, creating those policies and procedures, or just meeting new people and getting to know them helps to lead to success in those organizations. So the key takeaways from this lecture is that the baseline is diversity is related to inclusion and exclusion. Who has access to sport, to play, who has access to leadership positions in sport, and how, and what does that look like? Another key thing here is legal mandates. So laws really have played a key role in expanding access to sport, jobs, to opportunities to play. Without Title IX, without the American with Disabilities Act, groups of people may still not have access. And then finally, as I just discussed on the previous slide, leadership is really important. Good leadership, communication, support from the top is really key in establishing a diverse culture, or a culture that welcomes diversity within an organization.